All right, well, welcome everyone. Thank you very much for joining us here at ANU on beautiful campus. And also thank you for joining us online. There's a very large cohort of participants online. And of course, you're joining us for the annual ANU climate change update. The climate update, now in its 8th year, brings together experts, policymakers, students, industry, and the community to discuss the state of the climate and what can be done to tackle climate change. My name is Frank Jotzo. I'm the head of energy at the ANU Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions, otherwise known as ICEDS. At ICEDS, our goal is to advance innovation in the areas of climate change, energy transition, and disaster risk science. We facilitated integrated approaches across disciplines, integrated approaches to research, teaching, engagement with policy, industry, and the community. And a core part of our outreach really is a focus on solutions, providing you with the latest research on how we can respond to the shared challenge of climate change. And that's, of course, very much the spirit of this afternoon. Before we start the first session, I'm delighted to invite Aunty Mary Mudford to provide a welcome to country. I've got a short bio for you, Mary, as well. Mary Mudford is a Ngunnawal woman and a traditional custodian of the ACT region. She's active in creating change and inclusion for her community. Mary has worked in government, in the ACT in New South Wales, in environmental and land management for 18 years in various roles. She's manager of traditional custodian engagement, ensuring that culturally appropriate engagement is done with traditional custodians in the early stages of projects. And the goal, of course, is to ensure that self-determination of cultural values and aspirations informs aspects of planning and management here in the Australian Capital Territory. Welcome, Mary. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I might just have to adjust this just a little bit, please. I'm a bit shorter than Frank. Yoma. Can everybody say Yoma with me? Yoma. Yoma is our word for hello. I'd just like to thank the organisers today for inviting me to participate in this event this afternoon. Climate change is really important to me and to my community. So it's quite a pleasure to be able to share some reflections this afternoon with you. But firstly, I would like to provide a welcome to country for you in my language. Nungul, Yungul, Daurawari, Ngunnawal. Yungul, Yungul, Nullawiri, Dunimanyan, Ningara Dindi, Ngunnawal born, Daurawari, Yumalundi. Today we are gathered here on Ngunnawal country. Together we are meeting in peace and harmony. Today we also pay our respects to our Ngunnawal elders, both male and female, and also to Ngunnawal country itself. And I welcome you to our lands, the Ngunnawal lands. Thank you. Climate change for First Nations people has been a topic that's been discussed for quite a while, but our voices sometimes are missing from conversations in states and territories across Australia because it's felt that others have more experience and knowledge and understanding of climate change. But it's really important to engage First Nations people in climate change discussions, whether it's about climate change adaptation or just climate change itself. But we were the first people who walked these lands. We were the first voices that spoke on this land. We were the first land managers of these countries. And we are multiple countries in what we call Australia today. And it's really important to understand that our voices are critical to the conversations because we have a very intimate relationships with each of our own countries. We understand and walk our country so often that we see what is happening through climate change. It's really important to understand to us that our ecosystems are not just an ecosystem. They are part of the family of our country. And just as It would be such a loss to me to lose a member of my family. For us, it is a huge loss to lose any species of flora or fauna from our country, because they are a family of their own. And for us to lose one part of that ecosystem, we have all seen what happens when we lose something from the ecosystems. It changes the way that everything else interacts and survives. It's really important to us as a people that people recognise that for us to lose, and particularly our animals and plants, it is crucially hard on us, because it's part of our cultural practice of who we are as a culture. For us, for example, here on Ngunnawal country, if we were to lose the red box gum, it would be heartbreaking for us. It is critical to part of our cultural practices in terms of collection of and making of tools and weapons. If we were to lose some of our medicine plants on this country, it would impact how we as a community have the opportunity to heal ourselves and our families and our young people. It's really important for us, and sorry, I'm just going to take a drink of water. My lips just all of a sudden got very dry. It's really important for us that we have the opportunity to continue our cultural practices, because for too long we were denied the opportunity to do so. A lot of people think that through colonisation and that we lost our knowledge of how to care for our own countries. But knowledge is never lost. It is sleeps, and it is waiting for us to awaken it. I'll just share a story from an elder from the Northern Territory, just as an example of that. So he was the elder and holder of knowledge for a particular piece of artwork in Kakadu National Park, and he was dying. And he had not shared the story and knowledge of that artwork with his children or grandchildren. And on his deathbed, they were all hovering over him with anthropologists, archaeologists, park staff, all begging him to tell them the story. And he kept telling them, no, I am not sharing the story with you, because you have not shown the respect that is required to obtain that knowledge. And he passed away without telling anybody that story. But before he did, his words were, one day, one of my descendants will walk this country. They will come to that artwork. They will look at that artwork, and they will know that story, because it is passed through our dreaming, and it's passed through our ancestors to those who have the respect. And we are learning to reawaken that knowledge by honouring and respecting country. And that is critical part of our culture, to honour and respect country. And if we continue to allow what's happening through climate change to impact our country, it's going to break us as a people. Not just my people, but all First Nations peoples around Australia. There are conversations happening within First Nations communities right across Australia, because everybody is starting to feel the impact of climate change. I was at the ICEDS summit in 2022, and I was talking to some elders from the top end of Western Australia, and they looked at me and they said, oh, so what's going on your country? And I sort of looked at them and I'm, sorry, aunt, uncle, what do you mean? And they said, well, with the weather and stuff. And I was like, yeah, it's changing. It's different to what it used to be. We still have cold times, we still have warm times, but we're starting to experience them at different times in the year, not normally when we'd expect it. And the aunt leant over to me and she goes, I had to buy a jumper. And for her, that was absolutely unheard of on her country, to wear a jumper through the day in particular. So there are people there around Australia who are starting to notice, and they want to be part of the conversation. And I think it's really important that everyone allow us to be part of your conversations. As land managers, we just want to support and work with you collaboratively to see how we can create a shared practice that's going to support climate change and the impacts on our country. I think it's really important for all of us to understand that we can't work independently of each other, because if trying to do that, we're going to fight a losing battle separately, whereas we may be able to create an opportunity to work together that's really going to have an impact on the issues that are important to us. It's also really important to understand the life cycle for us of our journey with our plants and animals. When we take something from country, we thank country for that gift and allowing us to take it. We ask country for that gift first, because to us, we're taking something out of the environment that has a family that is important within the landscape. And it doesn't matter if there's multiples of it, it's still important to recognise that one becomes two, becomes three, and eventually we just keep losing more and more. One of the most important things for us, if we're going to take something out of our environment, we make sure that we use every part of what we are taking out of the environment. Currently, my community here are part of a Buru management plan. Buru is kangaroo in my language. And the community have been, some of our community members have been very upset about the culling that happens in the ACT. But then once they had an understanding that our grasslands are being impacted by the overpopulation of kangaroo, they began to think about how they could support our grasslands as well as maintain our kangaroo population to a safe level as well. And I think it's really important that in understanding how we do things, it can help to shape and inform how you do things in the work that you do to support or climate change adaptation or the climate change work that you do. I think it's critically important for all First Nations people here, and I apologise, I forgot to acknowledge if there's other First Nations people in the room today. I do pay my respects to you as well. But I think it's really important to understand the First Nations people that you're working with, while they may be living here in the ACT, they don't know our country. And it's really important that you also engage with the Ngunnawal people, because we know our country intimately. We know our places, we know our law for this country and our stories of country. And for those First Nations people who are not Ngunnawal living on this country and working on this country, they don't have that information. So it's really important to include us in their conversation and to work with them as well, because it's really heartbreaking when we have people telling us how to manage our country that are not from this country. And we say that with utmost respect to everybody, but it's time for Ngunnawal people to be part of the conversation on this country. And it's part of, it's also important for Yorta Yorta to have that conversation on their country, for the Yolngu people up in Southeast Arnhem Land, because all of our practices, while some of them are similar, we do have different law. We do have different ways of doing things, and we do have different ways that we need to show and respect our country. One of the things that we as Ngunnawal people are seeing on our country at the moment is our plants are going into dormancy early, or at times when they shouldn't, or they're flowering or fruiting at times that they shouldn't be. And to us, this is really concerning, because we're worried if this continues, how is that plant going to evolve and change into the future? And are those plants going to be available to us to use for our cultural practices? And that is really important to us. We can't keep losing plants and animals out of our landscape here that are critical to our cultural practices. And that could be for the collection of, for making tools, weapons, for making possum skin cloaks. It could be making kangaroo blankets. It could be whatever. But if we keep losing these creatures from our environment, it's going to impact us as a people and our ability to continue and pass on our knowledge and cultural practices to our future generations. And that is what is most critical to us, the future generations. We want to be able to leave an environment for them that they can continue the practices that our elders and our ancestors have carried on for tens of thousands of years. And it's really heartbreaking for us to see changes coming into our environment that we may not be able to change, but we need to work together to better understand, can we change what is coming, or do we just need to adapt? One of the things that my community had said at a yarning circle on climate change adaptation is, why do we have to adapt? Why do we have to assume that we're going to lose things? Why can't we just plan that we are going to make sure that our plants and animals are still going to be in this landscape into the future? So it was a really hard concept for some of our staff from the Office of Nature Conservation, who were like quite shocked at that part of the conversation happening. And then when it was identified that, you know, one of the options that was put on the table with the community was that we would translocate plants and animals from other locations throughout Australia that might survive in the future climate. And the community just went, no, you're not. Why are you doing that? And they explained the purpose of it. And then community said, but you can't take something from somebody else's country without the proper respect for country and people and for those plants and animals, because you're taking a family member from that community and you're transplanting it into our community, and you were just planning on doing that without involving us? How is that right? How is that right? So we're now having a lot more conversations with the Office of Nature Conservation to ensure that the Ngunnawal perspectives and values around climate change are respected and acknowledged in the work that's being done into the future. And I hope that ANU can do that with us as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Aunty Mary, and I will speak through the raising of the curtains, introducing our Vice-Chancellor. So it's a great pleasure, of course, for us to be welcoming our new Vice-Chancellor and President, Professor Genevieve Bell. And in fact, it is Professor Bell's one of your first speaking engagements in that new role. So that's particularly notable. Now, in addition to being academic, public thought leader, and all of these other things, Professor Bell is a vice president and a senior fellow at Intel Corporation, is currently a member of the Prime Minister's National Science and Technology Council. Genevieve is a renowned anthropologist, technologist, and futurist. She spent more than 2 decades in Silicon Valley helping guide Intel's product development, social science, and design research capabilities. Professor Bell returned to Australia in 2017 to establish the 3A Institute at ANU, a collaboration with CSIRO's Data 61. And in 2021, Professor Bell became the inaugural director of the new ANU School of Cybernetics. So please join me in welcoming Professor Genevieve Bell.
I figured after that extraordinary welcome, we should see what we were being welcomed to. So I'm sorry for those of you online. I know that just blew out the light, but I thought as we're here on Ngunnawal country, near Ngambri country, we should see the beautiful place that we get to be in. And one of the extraordinary aspects of this room is that you get to look out over this remarkable space behind us. Now, I know for the people who are organizing this conference, at some point they're going to want to put the blinds back down again. And I realize for you online, you're desperately hoping I will do that soon. But I wanted, at least, Aunty, if it's okay with you, to look at your beautiful country and be able to think about the fact that we're having these conversations not in any context, but in this context, in this place, with all of its extraordinary diversity and power and all of its fragility and all the work we have to do to keep it safe. So it is indeed, Frank, one of the first times I get to stand up as the Vice-Chancellor and President of the Australian National University, not the first, but one of the first. And it's hugely important to me that some of those firsts are here with our Indigenous Scholars Program and with our students. Because when I think about the things that really matter here and the things that matter to me, it's those things. And I too want to acknowledge where we are today on Ngunnawal lands, near Ngambri lands, in a place that was always sacred, that was never ceded, and in a place surrounded by places that have wakeful owners and wakeful custodians. And I want to reflect that I spent 30 years living in the United States, and for 30 years I went to events and no one ever called the names of the people whose country I was on. No one ever said I was on the lands of the Lenape or the Anishinaabe or the Alawan or the Shoshone-Bannock. And when I look back at that, I think about those silences and what it meant to be in places where there were histories like ours and never called. And there's something extraordinary for me to get to be home 7 years now and to get to call those names and to think about what it means. In the school that Frank just mentioned, when he introduced me, we had some of our first PhD candidates come through the process, and having PhD students is one of the ways I think universities renew themselves. Undergraduates, yes, but also PhDs. And our first collection of PhDs came, and one of our students acknowledged where she was and then said, in the light of the conversation we were having, it wasn't enough to acknowledge, you also had to commit. And for her, it wasn't enough to acknowledge where she was, it was about how do you commit to more and to different. And when I think about what it means to be the Vice-Chancellor here, in a place that was deliberately created, the city and the university, and in a place that was consciously created, the city and the university, a commitment is a commitment to conscious activity, not choices by inaction, but deliberate activity. And as I've been thinking about what it will mean to be Vice-Chancellor, and I will commit to being only 36 days in, not 8 years, Frank, 36 days into the job. And you can imagine 36 days into any new job, you're still going, uh-oh, uh-oh, uh-oh. And occasionally going, oh my God, how fabulous is that? I'm still more uh-oh than fabulous, but you know, it's about what you should expect. In the process of thinking my way into the role, I did one of the things I often do in my scholarship, which is to go back and look at where we came from. Not because I think history teaches us the answers, but because I think history sometimes gives us really good questions to ask and can orient us to the choices we've made and the reasons that got us to the place we're in. Not that that should mean that it has to always be true, but because it gives us a little bit of an understanding of how we got here. And in thinking about the Australian National University, one of the places I inevitably would go back would be Nugget Coombs. He's one of our founders. He's someone I was lucky enough to know as a child. I probably have the dubious distinction of being the only Vice-Chancellor in Australian National University's history who has been taken 10-pin bowling by a former Chancellor of this university, because Nugget did once take me 10-pin bowling in Alice Springs when I was a kid, in his glorious 3-piece suit, and me, I'm sure, barely in a pair of thongs. And, you know, he didn't let me win, which is good. But when I think about him and what his colleagues were doing, I was interested to think about what it is they imagined they were up to in building this place. Good news is you don't have to imagine, because Nugget wrote it down. And when he wrote about building this place, he said that he and his colleagues were thinking about the world that had been and all the chaos they had come out of. In this particular instance, in World War II. But when he's writing about this place, he's sitting in 1970, thinking about the extraordinary social upheaval that has been the 1960s. So in his mind, he has 2 periods of incredible upheaval, a world war and a form of radical social remapping. And in both of those moments, he finds himself contemplating, why would we set about building a national university? And what he says is that we have in these moments of collectivism to be forced to imagine what the future is going to be. That when we are battling in the present, we have to have a deliberate view about what the future should look like. And that deliberate view needs to be informed by where we are, but needs to be different than the place we find ourselves. And in 1970, he says of this place that we imagined that we were going to create a place that would give us the knowledge to make the future wisely. That we were going to build a place that would let us tackle the social, political, and economic challenges of today and build something for tomorrow. And the phrase he used to describe that, he said that what he thought the National University would be was a powerhouse for social reconstruction. That is a heady phrase. I'm going to say it again because I'm really quite liking it at the moment, the powerhouse for social reconstruction. Now, I realize powerhouses are a complicated word too. I'm not unaware of their complexity, but if we imagine it as the energy source the source of deliberate, concerted energy creation to imagine and build, those feel like really good ideas. And of course, like all good storytellers, Nugget goes on to say, of course, we didn't quite get there the first time around. We built a university, and it was a university, his phrase is, of quality and distinction. But one, he said, that was more geared to the demands of eternity than the parochial needs of the politician or the reformer. And I suspect, standing in 2024, we don't have the luxury of making those trade-offs anymore. Here, we need to be both a university of quality and distinction with all the pieces that entails in the 21st century. Critical thinking and critical doing, interdisciplinarity, a commitment to being excellent across all the dimensions we encounter, where excellence is not what it meant 100 years ago, but is something very different. And we also have to work out how we're committed to making the knowledge to build wisely. And for me, those two pieces of the puzzle make this an extraordinary place to be in, an extraordinary moment to be in. It also means that every conversation we have about the critical issues of now, reconciliation and truth-telling, First Nations knowledge, climate change, all of those feel like they are the things we need to tackle and the things around which we need to build wisely. So I'm really excited that we get to have this moment. I know it will be a hard afternoon. I know that the data does not necessarily bring comfort, but I also know that we get to make choices about how we want to engage with the knowledge that we have, how we want to use it to build wisely, and how we want to continue to be a source of energetic, deliberate imaginings of the future, and a future that we get to, as much as we can, actively bring into existence, not passively stand by it. So I'm incredibly happy that this is one of the first places I get to be this year. I'm incredibly proud of Mark and all of the ICEDS team. And I'm incredibly grateful that you could physically be here in the room, for those of you who braved the rain, our ongoing parking infrastructure, and our lack of commensurate signage to get you here, and the fact that our online map system isn't. And I'm really grateful to those of you who found your way online. And I promise we're now going to lower the shades again so that you can go back to an appropriate level of high contrast between the speaker and the backdrop. And I hope that you will, for a day, find the knowledge to build wisely. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Vice-Chancellor, for sharing some element of your vision for the university with us, and for recounting that that important piece of national and local history so eloquently, and garnishing it with your interpretations, which I think are important for the years to come here at ANU. We now move into the program proper for the climate update, and the overview session on climate change is by Professor Mark Howden, of course, the director of the ANU Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions. Now, Mark is not just a key person in this field at ANU, he's also an honorary professor at Melbourne University, vice chair of a working group of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. He's the chair of the ACT Climate Change Council and a fellow of the Australian Academy of Technology and Engineering. Now, Mark, if you don't know, helped develop both the national and international greenhouse gas inventories that are in many ways fundamental part of the Paris Agreement, and has assessed sustainable ways to reduce emissions, among many other things in his very wide research portfolio. He's worked on the science, climate variability and change, climate impacts on critical systems such as agriculture, and is a pioneer on how we can take effective action to adapt to climatic changes. Now, Mark has been a major contributor to the IPCC since 1991, and he's had roles in the second, third, fifth, sixth, and now seventh assessment report. Now, Mark will give us a keynote presentation that will immediately be followed by an open Q&A session here in the room and online. And so we, of course, invite you warmly to already think of and prepare your questions so that we can have a lively exchange then. Please welcome Mark Howden.
So thanks very much, Frank, for that introduction, and thanks very much, Mary, for your welcome, and also for those reflections in relation to your interests, climate change, both the opportunities and the threats that it presents. And also thank very much, Genevieve, because climate change is all about making wiser choices for a better future, and that's what this session is about today. So what I'm going to do in the short time that I have, if I can get this to move, is cover in a somewhat eclectic way a series of information which is relevant to what happened particularly last year in relation to climate change. And so the core sort of message, in a sense, is in the title. So we're seeing, overwhelming climate change in some respects, and very hobbled responses, both nationally and internationally. And so whilst Renee sorts this out, there's a huge amount of information that fits in here that I could cover, and so it is necessarily a very limited take on what's available. Now, one of the key things that I put up every year at this climate update is a graph of carbon dioxide emissions across the globe. So if we look at this graph, comes from the Global Carbon Project. Pep Canadell and colleagues put this together, and many other sources of information for decision making. Now, what we can see once again in this last year was those emissions were at record levels. We have not yet gone down in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, so we haven't started that decline that is necessary to put a lid on climate change. And so the first message is we're not on track to meet our stated goals in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. As a result of those emissions, we're seeing record levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So it almost peaked out at 425 parts per million last year, and pre-industrial levels were 280 parts per million or thereabouts. And when we look at the long-term record, there was a fairly recent paper that looked at the very long-term records, and we probably haven't exceeded this carbon dioxide concentration for 14 million years. So that's what humans are doing to our atmosphere. Associated with this record levels of methane emissions, nitrous oxide emissions, and various others, leading to record concentrations in the atmosphere of these key greenhouse gases, and all of them contribute to driving climate change. When we look at the amount of time we have available to take action here and to keep temperatures down to 1.5, a very recent paper sort of did those analysis, what we call a carbon budget, which I've talked about before at these events, and we really only have about 6 years left at current rates of emissions before we've effectively done our dough on keeping temperatures down to 1.5 degrees. So we're really not on top of this topic at all in terms of global responses. Now, understandably, put greenhouse gases in the atmosphere will warm the Earth. This is the most recent graph of this annual temperature increases across the globe, about 1.45 degrees above pre-industrial. And you can see that there's a strong curvilinear sort of element to that curve. So it's not just climate change is going up, but it's going up faster and faster over time. So it's accelerating. When we look at the records here, 1.45 degrees is a very, very significant step up from any previous temperature, and I'll show you what that looks like in a second. Importantly, last year, for the first time, is that global temperatures were assessed as exceeding 2 degrees on 2 separate occasions in November last year. That's information from the Copernicus group in the European area. Now, what this looks like on a month-by-month basis, I think is really telling. So this graph, which comes from that group, shows month by month across each year. So each horizontal sort of wiggly line is a different year. They're color-coded, so the years associated, say, with the Second World War are blue. They go to red colors as we approach the present. And we can see that since June of this year, we were amazingly far out of any previous temperature. So it wasn't just that we were record breaking, but this was a massive, massive break in the records. And you can see that graphically here, the gap between 2023 and any previous year. And this, one of climate science over in the US, when he looked at this, he said, this is gobsmackingly bananas, was his description of it, very scientific description of what is a really quite terrifying graph. And the problem is that this gap between any previous year's record and the current record has actually extended into January. So it wasn't just 2023, it continues. And so we've seen essentially that line go horizontal. We don't know at this point whether this is an aberration or a step change, or whether this is in fact some beginning of a new phase of climate change. So just on the weekend, there was a paper that was released on this, which looked at the likelihood of getting this type of temperature and splitting it up into things like what's due to climate change, what's due to internal climate variability, such as El Nino, La Nina, what's due to the Tonga volcano, and what's due to the big reduction in shipping pollution that occurred a couple of years ago. And the answer they came out with is you can't explain this simply by the climate change and variability signals alone. There are other things going on which we don't fully understand. And the particularities of that are the shipping ships often ran on very dirty fuel, and so it produced lots of sulfate pollution. That sulfate pollution caused lots of health problems and environmental problems, but at the same time, it kept the atmosphere cooler. It kept the Earth's surface cooler because these sulfates reflect sunlight. Now, when you clean up one problem, what has possibly happened is we reveal another problem, which is starting to reveal that previously disguised temperature warming. So that's one possible explanation. The other is the Tonga volcano. Because it was a subsurface undersea volcano, it put a huge amount of water vapor into the upper atmosphere, and that takes a long time to settle out of the atmosphere. And that water vapor could be influencing temperature. But previous assessments of the influence of these factors, again, don't add up to what we're actually observing. So there's some real important need for additional research to understand what's going on in our systems. Now, to display what that looks like on a spatial basis, so we've gone on a temporal basis, moving into a spatial basis. This is a map from NASA over in the US, and what that shows is temperature anomalies for last year, and you can see that effectively every part of the world was significantly warmer than the long-term average. And this is a relatively recent baseline, 1951 to 80. And importantly, you can see that there's big parts of the Northern Hemisphere which are extraordinarily hot, including places that were like 5 degrees warmer than the long-term average, but also West Antarctic Peninsula, and that's accelerating the warming that we're seeing. And of course, that warming then generates sea level rise. And that warming also has biological impacts, and that level of warming is so raised concern amongst the coral reef conservation community that their previous heat warming system had to be upgraded to get 3 new levels of warming, just in the same way as our fire system warnings had to actually start to increase the number of warnings, and we've got that catastrophic level now that we didn't have previously. So what we're seeing already is so significant that it's actually causing a fundamental rethink of the classifications. So we're having to classify things in ways which we never expected to have to do in the past. Now, if we actually look at what's likely to happen over the next decade or two, obviously one of the key thresholds is the 1.5 degrees that the Pacific Islands nations inserted into the Paris Agreement. And as a fundamental threshold that we're looking to maintain and stay within. So this is, again, a graph from the Copernicus Institute looking at temperatures. There's a linear regression line through that. You track out where that regression line crosses over the 1.5 degrees sort of mark. And the answer is at current rates of change, at linear rates of change, we're likely to exceed 1.5 degrees in 2033, so 10 years from now. If we actually do something which matches a little more closely the data and just do a curvilinear line through that, we actually see that we're probably going to exceed 1.5 degrees by 2028, a handful of years away. A literal handful of years away. And at the pace of change, the first slide I showed you, where we still have not started to turn the curve and start reducing our emissions, a handful of years seems like a really, really big challenge to start to actually address this in a significant way. Now, as a result of that warming, we see lots and lots of impacts, amongst others, extraordinary melting of the Greenland ice sheet. And so we're seeing breakdown happening in ways we simply did not predict just a handful of years ago. And that's generated huge sort of other effects such as sea level rise, which I'll show you in a second. If we look at the southern hemisphere, the sea ice around Antarctic was the minimum on the lowest on record, both for the maximum and minimum extents, the summer and winter extents. And there's assessments now that we may well have entered into a new era of sea ice that we're unlikely to go back to previous sea ice extents because of the inherent feedbacks in that system. And if you look at sea level rise, obviously, if you've got lots of melting ice, glaciers and ice sheets, etc., the sea level obviously tends to go up. This is a relatively recent record, but last year it went up around 10 millimetres. Over the last couple of decades, it tends to have gone up roughly about 4.5 millimetres per year. If we look back at last century, it went up about 1.8 millimetres per year. So we're seeing essentially like, potentially up to a 5-fold increase in the rates of sea level rise per year. That uptick, we have had significant increases in sea level rise in the past due to various factors, but it is really worrying the linkage to this to that high temperatures, which I showed you before. We also had huge wildfires in Canada, but obviously not restricted to Canada. And you can see that the scale of these wildfires that they experience are similar in nature to what we experienced in our Black Summer. So about 18 million hectares burnt in Canada, and that is the sort of largest on record. And that generated huge amounts of pollution, including air pollution in New York City, and you can see the Empire State Building here in this graph, very, very reminiscent of what Canberra and other Australian cities experienced in the Black Summer. All of a sudden, these issues come home to people who live far away from those fires. And it wasn't just in Canada, but we saw massive fires in Hawaii, in Chile, South America, and Europe and others, leading to significant loss of life. Chile, for example, is just experiencing wildfires with the highest ever number of deaths. That's happening almost as we speak. We're seeing extreme rainfall propagate continually across the globe, with floods happening regularly in places that they were infrequent in the past, with an absolutely massive event in Libya associated with what's now called a Medicane, a sort of a Mediterranean cyclone, essentially flooding Derna. That's the picture down the bottom, a city in Libya, and possibly killing up to 11,000 people in one hit. This is extraordinary. And we saw Tropical Cyclone Freddie earlier around this time last year. And this tropical cyclone just kept on going and going as it went from the Australian part of the Indian Ocean right across to Africa and then back up into the Indian Ocean. And it was the longest lived, the most accumulated energy, and the most serially, multiple sort of rapid intensification cyclone on record. This is a picture of the future. It is quite scary. And sorry, what's happening on this one? And so just, I don't know why it's not working anymore. And then moving a little bit more locally, we see this study, which has come from some colleagues here in Australia, looking at rates of domestic and non-domestic violence, both inside and outside. And without going into huge amounts of detail, pretty much all of it is linked to temperature. So as the temperature goes up, violence goes up. The way in which it happens depends on the context, whether you're inside or outside, and it's domestic or otherwise. Now, really important to note that particular domestic violence is very gendered. This differentially impacts on males and females. And so when we're starting to think about these things, we need to think about those complexities and those interactions that occur. So just, where are we up to, Alex? So when we're starting to look at those sort of issues, we see this accumulation of information, which is that the climate is changing, and it's actually changing far faster than we anticipated even just a handful of years ago. So next two. And now I want to move in the next part of the talk to sort of three topics. One is the IPCC, next is COP28, and lastly, a little bit on policy action in Australia. The first of these is the IPCC reports. And so we finished the last cycle of the IPCC last year. That's the 6th assessment cycle. We're now into the 7th assessment cycle. What's pictured here are all of the reports from this, starting from the special report for 1.5 degrees through to the synthesis report. And I've actually put up the topic that these IPCC reports are dangerous. And amongst other things, they're dangerous because the cumulative weight of those is 27 kilos, and that starts to enter into the space where this is a dangerous item to pick up. And you actually can't pick this up in many jurisdictions unless you have mechanical help or you have someone else to help you move this thing. These are incredibly massive reports. Natalie totaled up the number of pages for this, and so there's 9,880 pages of in these reports. There's a huge amount of information, many tens of thousands of references, hundreds of thousands of comments to make these reports more relevant and more effective. And if you haven't looked at something on climate change, grab hold of the summary for policymakers of the synthesis report, because it's a telling compilation of what we know about climate change. And Frank Jotzo, sitting here, was a lead author of that synthesis report, has been very active in the IPCC as well. Now, just a few key messages coming from the synthesis report. So what we have here is a graph of potential trajectories of greenhouse gas emissions going out to the future. The top sort of orangey plume is what we can expect with existing policy settings. If we want to keep to 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees, we have to go onto the green, the blue trajectories that angle downwards, heading down towards zero, and in some cases below zero in the case of carbon dioxide, and 1.5 degrees. We can't achieve 1.5 degrees without going below zero. And when we look at that, we've got a real challenge here, because the gap between where we're going, current policies, and where we need to go, which is the 1.5 degree and 2 degree trajectories, is massive. And we haven't got in place the policies and technology that's going to take us there at the moment. And if we're going to achieve 1.5 degrees, we have to have really, really significant reductions of greenhouse gas emissions in the very near future. We can't wait till 2050. It has to happen right now. And in fact, if we don't start on the downward trend by 2025, the best estimate that is too late to achieve 1.5 degrees. It's next year. So we have not got time to waste here. If we want to stick to 2 degrees, it's a more lenient sort of set of reductions, but still those sorts of emission reductions, such as 27% by 2030, still exceed those of many companies, many organisations like universities, and many governments across the world. So we're significantly undershooting in terms of emission reduction. We're going to significantly overshoot in terms of temperature as the best estimate. Now, Frank's talked about this, but I think it's really important to cover is that when we look at the sets of options available to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, there's a huge number of these. There is no shortage of things that we can do. And a big slab of these can reduce greenhouse gas emissions using existing technologies. And the assessment from the IPCC is for less than $100 US a tonne of carbon dioxide, we can actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions by about 50% compared with 2019 levels by 2030. And around half of that portfolio of options are less than $20 US a tonne. And for quite a few of them, you actually make money. So for example, from renewables. So there's really good reason to think that if we got serious about this, we could make a big dent in our greenhouse gas emissions, but we're not doing that. And if we design these well, they can not only reduce greenhouse emissions, but they can also help us adapt to future climate change, and they can also help us achieve sustainable development goals. When we look at some of the other good news stories coming out of the synthesis report, is that assessing the cost and the adoption of different renewable technologies, we see that cost keeps on coming down and down and down, and the adoption keeps on going up and up and up. And that's the same whether we're looking at small-scale solar, large-scale solar, onshore wind, offshore wind, and in terms of batteries. So there's good reason to think that these relationships of cost and adoption are going to continue, and that can be helped by governments, by active government policies. And we do have quite a bit of that policy setting here in Australia. When we look at the adaptation part of the picture, that's the responding to climate change, the IPCC documented a huge amount of options that are available and known in terms of how to adapt to climate change. And I've just listed a few here. So dealing more effectively in planning, don't put people in floodplains, for example. Dealing more in terms of infrastructure, so build climate friendly futures. So buildings that are appropriate to our future climate, not just to the present climate. We have preparedness and response capacity and building capacity right across places like Australia and the Pacific. And the list goes on. We can integrate climate change responses to generate co-benefits. So having climate action that also generates conservation outcomes, for example. So we can do these. We know a lot about how to do it. Again, we're just not doing it. Really importantly, the IPCC identified that political commitment was actually a really important part of adaptation. So having clear signals from governments, bipartisan agreement or tripartisan agreement, that we want to deal with climate change and we're going to deal with this in a consistent way, regardless of who's in government, is a really important part of the picture, just as is education. So bringing the level of climate knowledge up of the average person so they don't confuse climate change with the hole in the ozone layer, for example. So there's a lot that we can do, and we know a lot about how to do it. Unfortunately, not all sectors have easy answers, and one of those is the finance sector and the insurance sector. And we're seeing increasingly stress in our insurance system, including through people speculating that climate change may actually bust the insurance system, and that would throw a massive, massive spanner in the works for our economies here and elsewhere. We also see the assessment in terms of the IPCC in terms of our adaptation performance. And so what the IPCC assesses essentially is on this slide, is that there are significant gaps between where we are in terms of our adaptation responses and where rationally we should be. And unfortunately, those gaps are growing, they're not shrinking, and they're affecting the poorest people most, the people often with least capacity to deal with climate change. We see that most of the adaptation responses that we can record and analyse, they're very fragmented, they're very incremental, so they're not transformational in their nature. They're often very sector-specific and not transferable, and they're often unequally distributed. So they're distributed differentially across different groups in the society or across different locations. We see that adaptation options which we think are in the bag and feasible now actually decrease in their effectiveness as climate change. So the very time we actually need them to be operating, they're likely to become less and less effective. So that means we have to be generating more and new adaptation options which are appropriate to the circumstance. A challenge when governments are still just struggling with adapting to the changes that we're seeing concurrently. And there's lots and lots of barriers to adaptation, including finance ones, but oftentimes we actually know how to overcome those barriers. We know how to overcome some of the social and psychological and equity issues associated with different adaptation options. But again, we're just not doing that. And we see right across the sort of progressive business areas, corporate governance, that climate adaptation is now just seen as good business practice. It's not an option, it's just normal. And many businesses overseas actually have bonuses built into their KPIs for their corporate executives that actually require that performance in terms of climate adaptation and emission reduction. We still haven't seen that here. Now, the last of these items, or maybe the second last, is looking at COP. COP28, Frank was there, I wasn't, so this is my take as an armchair critic of COP. So generally speaking, COP was seen as a success, is that pretty much every group that went there could come home and shout to their constituency, "I've had a win." And that generated really differential media sort of titles, for example. You know, one bunch saying, you know, it's the beginning of the end for fossil fuels, and the other saying, actually fossil fuels won at COP. You know, very, very diverse sort of perspectives. That's why I actually think that most parties there could actually go and wave the flag. So, for example, we had a global stocktake of progress, big tick. We said we're going to do that. Loss and damage fund became operational. Great. Food security and agriculture recognised. Absolutely good. Independence of climate and environment. No-brainer. Why shouldn't we do that? Adaptation goals agreed, something that's been on the burner since the Paris Agreement, but not achieved until now. And a whole stack of other aspirational goals, tripling of renewable energy capacity, accelerating reduction in non-CO2 gases, accelerating reduction in non-energy systems, and phasing out fossil fuel subsidies, et cetera, et cetera. All sounds great, except big question marks about this. So when you actually start to delve into this, it's just not as rosy as it looks from the surface. So for example, the global stocktake, major conclusion, we're not taking action fast enough. Bit of a no-brainer, but that's the thing. So we're failing is the message from the global stocktake. Loss and damage fund operational. Yep, great. But a lot of the mechanisms behind that are incomplete. So not very clear about how to get the money and how to partition it out. They gathered together about $800 million US, which is about 0.2% of what is assessed to be needed for the loss and damage fund. You make your own mind up whether that was a success or not. Food security and agriculture, similarly, big statement, the Emirates Declaration, everyone's going to put it in their national action plans, but a tiny, tiny fraction of the support that's needed to actually make that operational. Independence of environment and climate strategies. There was actually a reasonable amount of money generated on that, about 1.7 billion US dollars, but essentially it's just put on the back burner, kick the can down the road for the next meeting as to how to deal with this. Adaptation of goals agreed. So we've got 7 big adaptation goals, which sort of say build capacity and, you know, get more information. They're not very helpful when it comes to on-ground action. And that adaptation fund, again, the money that was put together for that at this meeting was 0.1, or in fact less than 0.1% of the assessed need. Again, it sounds great, but when you start to delve, it's not that great at all. And there's, I could go on with that story, but just to give you an example of if you start to dissect this, what does this look like? So this is one of the key statements coming out of the COP28. It's the transition away from fossil fuel statement, hugely argued by negotiating governments. And this is what was landed. So what it says is it calls on parties to transition away from fossil fuels and energy systems in a just, orderly and equitable manner. Who can argue with that? Accelerating action is critical decade. Sounds good. So as to achieve net zero by 2050 in keeping with the science. You know, like ticks all the boxes. So let's just dissect this a little bit. Calls on parties. What does that actually mean? So there is this little document which actually shows in negotiator speak the strength of different categories of demand from the parties to the convention. So the strongest one is parties instruct various other parties to act. The next one is request, then urges, then invites, and then recommends, and then, I can't read the other, encourages, and then right at the bottom, the weakest possible statement is calls on. So when you actually look back at this statement, this is the weakest possible language that the negotiators could agree on. So do you think that's been a real resounding success for those people who want action on climate change? Let's move on. Transitioning away, what does that mean? You know, a 10% reduction, 20% reduction, by when? Transitioning away is completely ambiguous. Energy systems, is that all energy systems or just electricity systems, you know, transport, stationary energy, you know, what does it include? Completely ambiguous. Just and equitable. Like we can see on our TVs every day that someone's just and equitable solution is another person's war crime. This is not easily resolved in the international courts. Accelerating action, what does that mean? Are we accelerating slowly or quickly? You know, what are we actually going to do here? Critical decade. Well, actually, it's the critical year. As I said before, we have to act before 2025. This isn't about the critical decade. This is about effectively tomorrow, the critical year. We'd need to count in months, not in years, in terms of the need for action here. And then net zero. By 2050, well, what the science actually says is that if we aim for 2050, we're too late at current trajectories for both 1.5 and 2 degrees. And if we go to net zero, it's not enough for 1.5 degrees. We have to go below zero. So when it actually says in keeping with the science, it's not. So what do you do with a statement like this? I mean, it's the best they could do, probably at the negotiating tables, but it's highly ambiguous and it leaves incredible space for argument for the future and incredible wriggle room. So when we start to look at these sorts of statements, and you could go through almost every paragraph of COP28 and take it apart in the same sort of way, there's not a huge amount of good news there for people who want climate action. Now, the last slide is on policy and action here in Australia. And so it's a mixed bag. So when we look at Australia's greenhouse gas emissions, if we take out the land use change, which is clearing is a one-off thing, so you can't stop clearing twice. And so when we take that out, is what we actually see is from 2005 to the current time, our emissions have reduced by 1.3%. To all intents and purposes, that's flatlining. And in fact, they went up last year. So between 2022 and 23. So we're not at a national scale doing what is needed in terms of reducing our emissions. If we look at aspirational targets, so for example, Queensland just announced their new emission reduction targets, 75% reduction by 2035. That's ambitious, it's great, it's what's needed. And then net zero by 2050, you know, slight argument about that, but that's pretty good. And we see Queensland starting to join most of the other states and territories in Australia with that goal. And so that's a really good thing. So that's a tick instead of a cross. We see renewables are driving incredible change and accelerating their impact on Australia. And so we see some really interesting sort of headlines coming up. So, you know, renewables halving energy price, you know, last quarter versus the quarter before. That at a global scale, nuclear and coal, et cetera, are going backwards. Renewables are taking up the slack. And some really interesting research that shows that economies which are based and heavily based on renewables actually recover faster from disruption than those which are based on fossil fuels. So we see good reason that renewables are a very positive thing, and Australia really is at the forefront, and particularly mums and dads, investors who put solar on their roofs are generating huge amounts of power to put into our electricity system. And Frank could tell you a lot more about that than I could. We see, so Commonwealth and other policies such as the Net Zero Economic Authority and the new vehicle emission standards, which just got announced as a open for consultation just on the weekend. These are really positive things. They can help the transition, they can help drive down greenhouse gas emissions, save money for consumers by having more efficient cars. You use less petrol, you save money, particularly as petrol prices go up. So these are really positive policies, and we need to appreciate them and recognise them and support them, because it's not all bad. We need to recognise that there is good action happening. But at the same time, as we got the good policies, we're also seeing opening of new coal and gas facilities here in Australia. And the Australian Institute did an analysis of those new facilities, and their assessment was that could emit around about 4.8 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide by 2030. This is not doing our part of a global solution. We understand all of the economic and other drivers of this, but it is challenging to reconcile these two parts of the equation. We also see in Australia a lot more legal cases, including cases about greenwashing brought by some of the regulators. And we also see green hushing. So a South Pole, it's a company, did a survey which actually found that more than a quarter of Australian companies were cutting back on their climate comms because they were seeing this as a potential vulnerability. Being too open about climate activity leads to potential litigation or other cases against them. And we also see some positive things there. So for example, we see the legislation which is open to assessment by the corporate world, amongst others, for mandatory disclosure of climate action. And at the moment, the anticipation is that that's going to be released in July and put in place. And that will be really positive because it actually enables people to make decisions much more effectively about things that they purchase, for example, or where they're going to invest their money. So we need more disclosure. We need that information. We need transparency. And the last point that I've put up here is that one of the bits of information that came out just over the last month or so was over the last year, our population increased by 624,000 people, almost 2/3 of a million people. You can't have that type of immigration without making the emission reduction job harder here in Australia. Let alone all of the issues about rental prices and traffic in cities, etc. There is a greenhouse gas consequence of increased population in Australia, just like there is a greenhouse gas consequence of extreme events. So if you think back to extreme events such as flooding in Lismore, one of the pictures that sticks in my mind is that the post-event scene, there's mounds and mounds of junk. Everyone's throwing out their sofas and throwing out their washing machines and throwing out this and that, the mud encrusted clothes, etc. And every one of those things has to be replaced, and every one of those replacements has a greenhouse gas footprint. And so that winds up climate change. So the more extreme events you have, the more of that happens, the more greenhouse gases you produce and the more extremes you get. We need to start thinking about how to break these feedbacks, break the cycle. Now, that's where I'm going to finish my talk, but it's really important to leave on a positive note, and that's actually where the next session takes up the slack, because when we see this is that what the assessments of people taking action is, people take action most when they actually see that there's both a concern, that's the talk that I've just given, but also where there's hope. And as Greta Thunberg said, hope comes from action. And so being able to go from anxiety to action is the topic of the next session, because we need to be able to be informed, but motivated, but committed to action in terms of climate change, because as I've shown you, there is no time to waste. Thank you.
All right, we've got 10 to 15 minutes for questions and answers, both online. We've got a list of questions here already. Pick up a few of those, but of course also we'll have that conversation in the room. And so please give me a signal, some sort of visual cue as to if you want to ask a question, make a comment, do that now so I can direct the traffic with the microphones while Mark and I sit down. Where we'll have the first question over here on my left. We'll go online first. And Mark, there's a number of questions online. One of them actually relates to the biophysical side of things. And the question is, how long will it take until we know if the 2023 is permanent or temporary, and for greater certainty as to the reasons of this extreme temperature anomaly that we saw last year?
A great question, which I don't know the answer to, and I don't think anyone knows the answer to. So probably two core sources of information. One is just observing how that anomaly continues. So as I mentioned in my talk, we're already seeing it carry over into the new year, so into January. Climate doesn't respect calendar year dates, so you'd sort of expect that to happen. But over the next year or two, I think we'll be keeping a very close eye on what happens there. And secondly is the understanding of the processes that are driving that anomaly, that huge variation in temperatures. So by understanding those processes, you can backtrack to seeing what's driving it, and then what the future might look like. So I think that research, which is already coming out now in the journals, as I mentioned, there was a paper on the weekend that I referred to, and I think we'll see quite a lot more analysis over the next year.
Question in the room, and please, everyone, feel free to let us know who you are, if you so feel.
Thanks, Mark. Guy Templeton. COP marks almost a lowest common denominator outcome, with a larger number of countries saying this is the minimum they can agree on. How much more hope, if any, do you get through looking at the commitments within countries particularly the large emitters, as opposed to the COP outcomes?
There is a way of looking at that, which gives you the lowest common denominator, and that's built into the UN voting approach, where nothing is agreed until everyone agrees, and so that's the sort of standard approach. So it only takes one country to say no, and you don't get progress. And so the real, for me, the real hope is actually outside of the COP processes. That's at national level. So we see about 24 countries across the world now with consistent emission reductions, so pushing down their greenhouse gas emissions, and at the same time with very significant economic growth. And as I showed you, improved ability to bounce back from disruption. And so, there's really positive messages there. If we go down this pathway of emission reduction, we can redesign our economies to be better than they were previously, and healthier. So you move away from coal to renewables, you clean your air up, so it's healthier for people. So for me, looking at that at a national level and similar at a company level and at a community and individual level, what I see is that's the source of action. That's the thing we should be relying on most, because movement at the international scale is going to become increasingly problematic. So putting pressure back up the system into the corporate world and into the politics, the state, federal politics particularly, is really important, because just tell your politicians, we want more, we expect more from you, because that's what most Australians want. 80% of Australians want more action on climate change. That's the Lowy Institute poll. That line is absolutely level across about 10, 12 years. So really, really consistent message.
He's over on the side. Yeah, go right ahead. There was a question over there.
Oh, sorry.
Wonderful.
Sorry.
Yes, no,
I'm
that's
looking at the
good.
screen. Sorry, it's Janet Salisbury here from the Women's Climate Congress.
Wonderful.
One of the declarations from COP28 was for gender responsive, equitable transition, but I noticed you didn't put that on your slide among the other success. And so I'm asking why you didn't put it up there, and if you don't think it's important. And just to say that I think that if you look at what happened at COP28 and the women's movement that were there and the pressure they applied, that was one of the reasons why we got transition away from into the statement. So I think it is a very important issue. Thank you.
Thanks, Janet, for all your work over many years. Also for that question. So the reason why I didn't put it up there was simply it's a single slide. So I was just focusing on the things that a limited subset of what was there. If I was giving a whole talk on COP28, it would have been there. And because I wasn't at COP28, I'm not across all of the dynamics that led to particular discussions and points of view being raised and carried through. If you step back, those words such as transition away from, even though and my critique is that they're weak and ambiguous, is that they're better than nothing. Like, it's actually a really important intent by a whole stack of negotiating parties for change. And so I think it's really good. It's just that I was flagging, this is incredibly wobbly and jelly-like, the thing that we're dealing with there.
Mark, we have a huge array of questions ranging across a number of topics. We'll go to one on adaptation from online before we come to a question in the middle on the left and then on the right. And the question on adaptation is from Michelle, asking, regarding growing adaptation gaps, are there any regions or sectors that are bucking the trend? Where there are any examples of good or successful adaptation that we can borrow from? Is the gap narrowing anywhere?
Yeah, it is, and it's in those places which have acknowledged that climate change is real and that it impacts on the things that they value, and where they have options to take action and the capacity to take action. Mm-hmm. And that varies tremendously from place to place. So there's studies which look at the lowest caste in India and find that they're surprisingly adaptable to climate change. And most people would have assessed that as unlikely, but in fact that's what that particular study shows. and through to some countries such as those in parts of Europe where they're adapting quite well. Not so much Southern Europe because it's getting much more problematic, and countries like New Zealand, sectors in Australia. So there's very patchy sort of adaptation performance across different sectors in Australia. And you could argue, for example, some of our water legislation is very effective in terms of its effectiveness as a climate adaptation response.
Yep. We've got a queue of three. In the middle first, Idris, then to left, then to the right. Please.
Thanks very much, Frank. I'm Idris Suleiman from ITP Renewables. Thank you very much for that very interesting overview. At the global level, you mentioned also about the influence of reduced shipping emissions. So transport has been kind of like the underbelly of a lot of the emissions. Would you be able to elaborate a little bit more about that, and particularly in the marine transport? Thank you.
Yeah. So thanks, Idris. So transport globally is around 15% of greenhouse gas emissions. That's a very narrow sort of framing of that, and it's comprised of many different components, including passenger cars and light vehicles, heavy lorries, shipping, etc. And of those, the shipping was actually a surprisingly big proportion, like it's several percent, like I think around 4% of greenhouse gas emissions. But at the same time, as I said, it was also producing lots and lots of pollution. And so because the shipping systems are spread right across the globe over the oceans, when you pollute from those ships, it had very widespread impacts in terms of climate and reflectivity of the clouds being produced. So you can look at satellite pictures and see the clouds, reflective clouds following where ships go across the ocean, for example. And so when you take out that source of pollution, it can actually be quite significant. Similarly, if you look at what happened in COVID, we had a big reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, around 6%, and that was largely due to reductions in transport. So COVID hit, people were shut down, weren't moving around as much, and that's what drove that temporary reduction in greenhouse gas emissions during COVID. So you can see the implications of transport through disruptions like that.
Question over here.
Thank you. Alex Gosman, and thanks for the great presentation. If you accept that collaboration at the international level by governments is not going to give us the solution, I'd probably argue that the graph you showed of the science advances and how rapidly that's been taken up will be the solution. But what do you see as the role in government in encouraging such science uptakes? Is it measures such as what the US has done with the Inflation Reduction Act, where they're funding a lot of startup science? Or is it at the policy level, things such as carbon taxes, or what Frank's doing, carbon adjustment measures, which actually makes the incentive for the polluter to actually invest in reducing their own emissions? Or is it a combination of all of them?
A combination of all of them, I think, is the answer, Alex. So we need to have a good portfolio of options to bring to bear for different contexts. So Frank, when he gave his talk after the synthesis report, was particularly focusing on the fact that we've now got a good menu of options for emission reduction, and we can start to piece together the appropriate sets of regulations and policy and R&D expenditure, etc., which are appropriate to context. And Frank, you could perhaps reinforce that if you wanted to. But one of the issues with the US is what it's doing is it's sucking huge amounts of IP and intellect into the US to solve their problems, which is actually leaving some other countries starved of talent.
And we've got two questions here in the second row in this section, and I think that brings us to the end before the break. We'll finish up with one online. Please.
Yeah. Hi, Mark. Marwan Al-Hassan, Fenner School. I've been attending this event for every year now for a few years, and it's getting more and more sobering for all of us. My question may be a bit of a hard one, but knowing what you know and what you share with us every year, how optimistic are you deep down inside that in 6 years' time we will meet again and look back and we say, we finally got it 6 years ago and started something, and we're seeing a change?
If I had to do a crystal ball side of things, in 6 years, I think we will have turned the corner. So our emissions will have started to come down, but they're likely to be emission reductions more in the 5 to 10% range than in the 30 to 40% range. That would be my projection. And so I think I am hopeful that we will take action, but I'm not hopeful that we will take action fast enough to avoid significantly increased damages from climate change. And you're right, like the picture that I spell out is actually getting worse and worse. And it's not just because I'm getting older and crankier. It's actually because the impacts of climate change are accelerating in ways that are very, very disturbing.
Yeah. It's the facts, not our perception of them. Question here.
Hi, my name's Sophie Moss. Thank you for sharing all your knowledge today. I was wondering, with the data you presented around 2023 being quite an anomalous year for temperature, we know we've sort of got these tipping points in our global climate system, which will give us sort of unpredictable, non-linear trends to look at. Is there any indication that those events, things like shutting down of the Gulf Stream, that those things are starting to happen?
Thanks very much for that question. There is a lot of evidence of change. So, for example, the Gulf Stream, the measurements that exist of that do show weakening of that circulation pattern, but not to the extent that it's likely to flip at this point. There's different views on tipping points, and it's I think it's probably fair to say it's a contested area of science. And that's because you're dealing with often the tails of distributions of change and our understanding of that change. My assessment, and that's supported by various others, is as long as we stay below 2 degrees, the likelihood of those cutting in a large scale is modest. Once we go beyond 2 degrees, the likelihood of those large scale tipping points, such as tundra feedbacks, methane being produced in tundra systems with melting, are likely to increase. And so I think it's also just a part of that argument as to why we need to keep a lid on climate change and not go into territory which gives us unknown and uncontrollable risk. So I hope that helps. But I think we do need to recognise that there are feedbacks, and there's feedbacks which are already acting in our systems. And I mentioned the tundra one. Soil carbon is another one. As the soil dries out and it gets hotter, you start to lose carbon from your soils. And so if you're in carbon sequestration sort of territory, a farmer wanting to store carbon, you're swimming upstream. Your system is losing carbon, and what you're trying to do is replace that and a little bit more. And so it just makes achievement of those goals harder and harder as climate change gets.
Mark, let's finish up with one of the hot button issues. You touched on the issue of coal and gas exploration and exports in your talk. That was also the grab that the ABC News chose in their brief discussion of the climate update this morning on the Canberra ABC News. We've got a question from online. Michelle Smith asks, could a speaker please comment on the desirability and possibility of a global levy on fossil fuels to fund loss and damage?
Yeah, so there's sort of lots of questions about this, and clearly when you've got a global problem, you need global action. And so when we're looking at possible instruments, something like some levy on greenhouse emissions, and it's not just on carbon dioxide, but the other greenhouse gases as well, it does come up. The challenge is getting this accepted at a international level, and I think my assessment is there's effectively zero appetite at the moment to do that, and that then devolves those discussions to nations and groups of nations, such as the Umbrella Group, to take actions into their own hands. and start to push policy forwards. And so that, for example, is what the EU do, and they've actually generated a huge amount of innovation through taking a very rigorous stance in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, including putting their own price on carbon or greenhouse gas emissions in their system, but at the same time putting things like carbon border adjustment mechanisms to protect those industries from countries who aren't playing on the same playing field as they are. And so it needs to be a complex and nuanced response. Simple responses don't work.
Wonderful. I think we have plenty of food for thought and conversation during the break. We will take a 20-minute break, resuming at 4:50. Repeating that for online, resuming 4:50. There's refreshments in the foyer that way, and the bathrooms are on this level here, accessible through the left and the right. Thank you very much for your participation.